Go ahead, read.
There necessarily follows an important first result, already arrived at from other viewpoints, that the ignorance cannot have the origin of its existence or the starting point of its dividing activities in the absolute Brahman or in integral Satchidanand. It belongs only to a partial action of the being with which we identify ourselves, just as in the body we identify ourselves with that partial and superficial consciousness which alternates between sleeping and waking. It is indeed this identification, putting aside all the rest of the reality behind us, that is the constituting cause of the ignorance. And if ignorance is not an element or power proper to the absolute nature of the Brahman or to its integrality, there can be no original and primal ignorance. Maya, if it be an primal ignorance, Maya, if it be an original power of the consciousness of the eternal, cannot itself be an ignorance or in any way akin to the nature of ignorance, but must be a transcendent and universal power of self knowledge and all knowledge. Ignorance can only intervene as a minor and subsequent movement, partial and related. Is it then something inherent in the multiplicity of souls? Does it come into being immediately Brahman views himself in the multiplicity. And does that multiplicity consist of a sum of souls, each in its very nature fractional and divided from all the others in consciousness, unable to become aware of them at all, except as things external to it, linked at most by communication from body to body or mind to mind, but incapable of unity? But we have seen that this is only what we seem to be in our most superficial layer of consciousness, the external mind and the physical. When we get back into a subtler, deeper, larger action of our consciousness, we find the walls of division becoming thinner, and in the end, there is left no wall of division, no ignorance.
No ignorance. Okay. So, I'll quickly read out the summary of what he's saying, then we'll go through the text. Okay, so. There are immediate important consequences for what he has said earlier. The starting point of ignorance is a dividing action of the mind. And the dividing action of the mind starts at the overmind level. This point is neither in the integral Brahman nor in the Satchidananda. It has its origin in the partial action of the being with which the individual identifies himself. He identifies himself either with the body, life, mind, in which case there is ignorance of the self, the self, or he identifies himself with the self, in which he is in the ignorance of the multiplicity, the activity. Both. Even if you are in the spiritual plane of consciousness, you don't identify yourself with the world, it becomes an illusion. That also is ignorance. Therefore, we can conclude that there is no self-existent, primal, independent ignorance. It is a result of a work in process, like sleep and waking. When in one state, the other is unreal, and vice versa. Okay? There is a higher Maya, which is a creative power of the supermind, and there is a lower Maya, wrongly identified as a creator of illusions. Maya and ignorance are not the same thing. Okay? So, is ignorance inherent in the multiplicity of souls? In Prakriti, is it that in the field of Prakriti, all souls are forever doomed to be in ignorance without any chance of union with other souls? We have seen that it is not so. An individual soul can rise in consciousness out of Prakriti, out of body-mind life, and achieve unity with all souls and even the entire universe. So, it is not in the ignorance is not in the universal Prakriti. That's what he said. Okay? Because you can continue to be in the body-mind life and yet not be in ignorance if you have realized the Supreme. That's what he said. Now, we'll go through each line. Oh, just 1 second. Yeah, that's right. So 598, just 1 second. Yeah. There necessarily follows an important first result, already arrived at from other viewpoints, that the ignorance cannot have the origin of its existence or the starting point of dividing activities in the absolute Brahman or in integral Satchidananda. So, Chandra is saying that the starting point, there is no ignorance. If you want very simple, non-philosophical language, in God, there is no ignorance in God. Okay? But when he starts manifesting himself, okay, he comes down and his absolute existence remains on top. And when he starts manifesting himself, his manifestation is not the same as himself. It's like the shadow and you. You and the shadow are different. When the shadow is thrown, that ignorance begins. When you are projecting yourself. Okay, that's what he says. Of his dividing activities, the absolute Brahman or integral self. By the way, he is talking of absolute Brahman and he is also talking about the integral Satchidananda. The absolute Brahman is different from the normal Brahman consciousness. In the normal Brahman consciousness, if you go to the spiritual planes of consciousness, you can be in ignorance. Okay? Because you still see multiplicity. You see oneness, but you also see multiplicity. Okay? But absolute Brahman is the highest. There is no ignorance. Or in integral Satchidananda. Integral Satchidananda. Why? Why is he saying integral Satchidananda? Because even in the lower planes of consciousness, you can have an experience of Satchidananda. I remember Vedanta saying that whenever I want, I can go into Satchidananda consciousness. But that cannot be the absolute Satchidananda. That will be when you rise, make your mind silent and go into the higher mind plane, you can experience Satchidananda. But it's not the full thing. That's why Srimati is using two words here to distinguish. Normal Brahman and absolute Brahman. Absolute Brahman is right on top. And normal Brahman, in which your mind becomes silent and you start seeing knowledge more than ignorance, then that is the normal Brahman. But absolute Brahman is the highest, where there is no ignorance at all. And also integral Satchidananda and Satchidananda experience on the lower planes of consciousness. There is a difference. It belongs only to a part. What belongs? The ignorance. It belongs only to a partial action of the being with which we identify ourselves. Just as in the body, we identify ourselves with the partial and superficial consciousness, which alternates between sleep and waking. See, because when we are waking, we think we are body-mind life. When we are sleeping, we are not identified with body-mind life. What are you identified with? You are identified with wherever planes you are dreaming. Dreaming is going into different planes of consciousness. Okay? But then there's no identification with body-mind life in sleep. If that were possible, then it would be a very conscious sleep. You know that you have a body-mind life, and yet you are dreaming. That's conscious sleep is something that only yoga can give you. It is indeed this identification, putting aside all the rest of the reality behind us, that is the constituting cause of the ignorance. In other words, when the one starts becoming the many, when God starts manifesting himself in the one become many, and we don't identify ourselves with all the many. We identify ourselves only with some of the many. Then ignorance starts. That's our problem. Okay. And if ignorance is not an element or a power proper to the absolute nature, just one second. If where is it gone? Yeah. And if ignorance is not an element or power proper to the absolute nature of the Brahman or to its integrality, there can be no original and primal ignorance. In other words, ignorance is not a fundamental reality independent of itself. It's a phenomenon which is depending on, it's a dependent conditional state of consciousness. Just like light, we have discussed this many times. There can be no darkness by itself. Darkness is only when you, in relatively to light. When light starts reducing itself, it becomes darkness. So darkness is a product of light reducing itself. Light is a fundamental reality. It can exist by itself, but darkness cannot exist by itself. So this is exactly the same thing he's saying about ignorance. Ignorance is not a fundamental reality. Inconscience also, in that sense also, you can say that inconscience is not a fundamental reality, nor is matter a fundamental reality. It's a product of involution. So if spirit disappears, there can be no matter. But if matter disappears, spirit can still be there. So there is a fundamental reality and a consequent reality. So the ignorance is a consequent reality. Okay? That's what he's saying. Clear, no? Now, Maya. Now we come to Maya. What is Maya? There is a higher Maya and a lower Maya. So I'll read the sentence, then we'll discuss it. Maya, if it be an original power of the consciousness of the eternal, cannot itself be an ignorance or in any way akin to the nature of ignorance, but must be a transcendent and universal power of self-knowledge and all knowledge. Okay? Ignorance can only intervene as a minor and subsequent movement, partial and relative. We'll stop here and discuss Maya. Maya originally is the power of the divine to create forms, real forms. Okay? But when you are in a lower consciousness, okay, when Maya from the highest level comes down, we have seen that all the powers of God, of Satchidananda, get reduced, okay, get diminished. So Maya also, the power of Maya gets diminished. Okay? And when it comes down, at the spiritual planes of consciousness as you experience Maya, you will see that apara prakriti, lower Maya. And the lower Maya, to you, it will seem as though it is creating illusions. Okay? So Maya has got three meanings. The first, highest Maya, para prakriti, the highest prakriti. Maya is nothing but prakriti. It's a power of prakriti. Okay? It is absolutely, it is creating real forms. So if you go to that highest level, you will see that Maya is, still the word Maya is very interesting because it's got the sense of magic. Okay? How can the infinite become finite? So that is the Maya. It's like a magician who is taking the infinite and making it finite. That is the original Maya. Then the second Maya is the power to create illusions. You know, when the highest Maya comes down, it becomes the apara prakriti, the lower Maya, the lower nature. And the lower nature is, when you are in that consciousness, it creates sense of illusion. Now there is a reason for that also. It's not that God is cheating you. When you are in the physical world and you are identified with body, mind, life, you see the physical forms and you think that they are real. But this is an illusion, because when you look at your own shadow, you don't, in the physical world, you don't see it as yourself. It is something less than yourself. But when you are in the physical world and identified with body, mind, life, then we think that that is real. We are thinking that the shadow is real. So that is ignorance, and that is the power of the Maya. So Maya at the lower level creates illusions, or so it seems to you, because you are at that level of consciousness. Okay? So that's what he's saying. Then he's asking a very interesting question now. Is it then something inherent in the multiplicity of souls? In other words, is universal nature, is the ignorance something fundamental there? That's what he's asking. Then, does it come into being immediately Brahman views himself in the multiplicity? That's what he's asking. Okay. This is a very interesting question. You have to think about it a little carefully. Does it come into being immediately? Brahman views himself in the multiplicity. So, Brahman can view himself on top and Brahman can view himself below. But when Brahman is the spiritual planes of consciousness, higher mind, element mind, intuitive mind, overmind. So there you can still see above and you can still see below. So when you see below, okay, is it that multiplicity is bound to create illusion? That's what Swami is asking. Then he himself answers and says, no, because we have seen that it is possible to remain in the physical world and yet have a consciousness of the Supreme. So you are not in illusion anymore. You see the physical world as really shadows only. Okay? So that's possible. So that's what he answers. Does it come into being immediately? Brahman views himself in the multiplicity. And what is the Brahman viewing himself? When you, the individual soul, goes to the Brahman consciousness, you become Brahman. So when he's saying Brahman views himself, is the individual who in the Brahman consciousness is viewing himself above or below. Okay? So does that multiplicity consist of a sum of souls, each in its very nature fractional and divided from all others in consciousness? Is ignorance something fundamental and permanent in which you can remain without escape? That's what he's asking. Then he says, now look at the words. Does multiplicity consist of a sum of souls, each in its very nature fractional? Fractional means you are identifying yourself only with part of yourself, not the whole. And divided from all others in consciousness, unable to become aware of them at all, permanently. Is it permanently there when you are in the multiplicity? Except as things external to it, linked at most by communication from body to body or mind to mind and incapable of unity? Then he himself answers, he says, but we have seen that this is only what we seem to be in our most superficial layer of consciousness. When you are identified with your body-mind life, the most superficial layer of consciousness is your body-mind life. So when you are identified with body-mind life, then you are in ignorance. But when you go to the spiritual plane of consciousness, not identified with your body-mind life, then knowledge starts increasing. Okay? And in fact, it increases so much that you feel that that's the ultimate. But the Isha Upanishad and Srimad both say that also is ignorance. Okay? So only when you go to the level 3, then you get totally rid of the ignorance. You see everything exactly as it is. The external mind and the physical. When you are identified with the superficial layer of consciousness, which is the external mind. Remember that there is an internal mind, there is a superconscious mind, there is also a subconscious mind. Mind is there everywhere. So, when we get back into that subtler, deeper, larger action of our consciousness, so it could be the subliminal consciousness or intraconscious, or it can also be the higher levels of superconscious. We find the walls of division becoming thinner, and in the end, there is left no wall of division, no ignorance. Look at the sentence very carefully. Okay? Now, he is using the word thinner. Okay? And so we'll look at what is in. But we have seen that this is only what we seem to be in our most superficial layer of consciousness, which is the body-mind life, the external mind and the physical. When we get back into a subtler, deeper, larger action of the consciousness, we find the walls of division becoming thinner. not absolutely thin, you see, thinner. In other words, ignorance is still there in the spiritual levels of consciousness. That means that level 2. And in the end, level 3, there is left no wall of division. So, see, the language is very clear, but you have to see very carefully. Okay? When you, level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1, ignorance for the individual, not in the universe, individual. And when the individual rises to level 2, the division becomes less because you can have a cosmic consciousness there. Remember, when you make your mind silent, you can see the physical world as unreal, or you can also see it as real if you are in the cosmic consciousness. But that's level 2 only. It becomes thinner, but does not absolutely remove the ignorance. You see multiplicity, but you also start seeing that there's all connected. There's a connection. That's why it's thinner. And in the end, level 3, in the supermind, there is left no wall of division, no ignorance. Wall of division creates multiplicity. So you see absolute oneness there. Okay, that's what you see. That's why the language is so important. Thinner. Okay, and then in the end, you have to interpret these things correctly. Now we can go to the next paragraph. Paragraph. Body is the outward sign. They have about 15 minutes. So,
should I read?
Yeah, Sunti, yes, you can read. Go ahead.
Body is the outward sign and lowest basis of the apparent division, which nature plunging into ignorance and self-nescence makes the starting point for the discovery of unity by the individual soul. Unity even in the midst of the most exaggerated forms of our multiple consciousness. Bodies cannot communicate with each other except by external means and through a gulf of externality, cannot penetrate each other except by division of the penetrated body or by taking advantage of some gap in it, some pre-existent division. Cannot unite except by a breaking up and devouring and swallowing and absorption and so on assimilation, or at most a fusion in which both forms disappear. Mind too, when identified with the body, is hampered by its limitations, but in itself it is more subtle. And two minds can penetrate each other without hurt or division, can interchange their substance without mutual injury, can in a way become parts of each other. Still, mind too has its own form, which is separative of it from other minds, and is apt to take its stand on this separateness. When you get back to soul consciousness, the obstacle to unify lessen, and finally cease to exist altogether. The soul can, in its consciousness, identify itself with other souls, can contain them and enter into and be contained by them, can realize its unity with them. And this can take place not in a featureless and indistinguishable sleep, not in a nirvana in which all distinctions and individualities of soul and mind and body are lost, but in a perfect waking, which observes and takes account of all distinctions but exceeds them.
Small paragraph, not a big one. So we'll see what we say. Yeah, there are 2-3 more paragraphs. Now he certainly is saying, when you are in the body consciousness, two solids cannot merge. Because what is cosmic consciousness? Subtle things can merge one into the other. I can become aware of your consciousness when my consciousness is merging with yours. So, 2 stones can become 1 stone. But 2 glasses of water can become 1 glass of water. It's possible. They can merge. And 2 containers of air and gas also can merge. So, in other words, multiplicity at the lower level in the physical plane, it's not possible to have a cosmic consciousness. But the cosmic consciousness is the merging of 2 substances. My consciousness is your consciousness. So it can start only at the spiritual level of consciousness, the very subtle, it becomes subtle. Okay? The substance becomes subtle. This is what is explained. Body is the outward sign and lowest basis of the apparent division. It's you think that you are separate because you are at a lower level of consciousness. The sign that you are using the instruments of senses. So your viewing is very limited. That's what it is. Body is the outward sign and lowest basis of the apparent division, which nature, plunging into ignorance and self-nations, the darkness created by itself, makes the starting point for the recovery of unity by the individual soul. Unity even in the midst of the most exaggerated forms of our multiple consciousness. When the individual soul rises out of identification body, mind, life, it can have a cosmic consciousness. Bodies cannot communicate with each other except by external means. What are the external means? Physical organs of sense. Eyes, ears, nose, throat, skin. Okay? But through a gulf of externality. There is a gulf of externality. What does it mean? There is a division between you and others. That's what it means. Cannot penetrate each other except by division of the penetrated body or by taking advantage of some gap in it. That also is possible. Because sometimes there can be possession. No? So, possession comes. Some pre-existent division cannot unite except by breaking up and devouring. So, two bodies can, for instance, a lion is eating a tiger, there is a unification between the two bodies. So, it's possible by injury and by by devouring, swallowing, and absorption, and so an assimilation, or at most a fusion in which both forms disappear. So that also is possible. Okay. Mind too, when identified with body, is hampered by its limitations. But in itself, it is more subtle, and two minds can penetrate each other without hurt or division. Physically, there will be hurt and division and injury. But at the mental level, the two minds can merge. That is exactly what is meant when Mother says that Swarna's consciousness and my consciousness are the same. That's what it means. That they are at a level where their consciousnesses can merge one into the other without harm. Okay. Mind too, when identified with the body, is hampered by limitations. But in itself, it is more subtle, and two minds can penetrate each other without hurt or division, can interchange their substance without mutual injury. This can happen. This is telepathy. Telepathy is exactly that. Maybe not fully, but you can receive the other man's thought into your own mind. Can in a way become parts of each other. Still, mind too has its own form, which is separative of it from other minds and is apt to take its stand on this separateness. When we get back to soul consciousness, so Srimya is going degree by degree. First of all, two bodies can't merge. Minds, yes, they can merge to a certain extent. What about the soul? It's even subtler. When we get back to soul consciousness, the obstacles to unity lessen, become less, and finally cease to exist altogether. Again, you use the word finally. Okay, that means at the highest level. The soul can, in its consciousness, identify itself with other souls, can contain them, and enter into and be contained by them. That's a cosmic consciousness. Can realize its unity with them. And this can take place not in a featureless and indistinguishable sleep. That means to say, the samadhi, It need not be a separated samadhi. Not in a nirvana, in which all distinctions and individualities of soul and mind and body are lost, but in a perfect waking, the waking samadhi, which observes and takes account of all distinctions but exceeds them. So it's possible to be conscious of the multiplicity and yet have the consciousness of unity. Okay? So these words are this. So they have got only they have got about 7 minutes now. So maybe we can read the next one. We have got 7 minutes, we can read the next one. Yeah? Therefore, ignorance. So, who will read next? Shilpa or Kiran, anyone, if you are attending.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I read that?
Yeah, Kiran, you can read. Go ahead, we don't have much time.
Yes. Therefore, ignorance and self-limiting division are not inherent and insuperable in the multiplicity of souls, are not the very nature of multiplicity of Brahman. Brahman, as he exceeds the passivity and the activity, so too exceeds the unity and multiplicity. He is one in himself, but not with a self-limiting unity exclusive of the power of multiplicity, such as is the separated unity of the body and the mind. He is not the mathematical integer, one which is incapable of containing the 100, and is therefore less than the 100. He contains the 100, he is one in all the 100. One in himself, he is one in many, and the many are one in him. In other words, Brahman is in his unity of spirit is aware of his multiplicity of souls, and in the consciousness of his multiple souls is aware of the unity of all the souls. In each soul, he, the immanent spirit, the Lord in each heart, is aware of his oneness. The Jivatman, illumined by him, aware of its unity with the one, is also aware of its unity with the many. Our superficial consciousness, identified with the body and with divided life and dividing mind, is ignorant, but that also can be illumined and made aware. Multiplicity then is not the necessary cause of the ignorance.
That's what he's saying. We still have 5 minutes, so I'll quickly go through it. Simple, what he's saying, nothing very complicated. So he's saying, therefore, ignorance and self-limiting division are not inherent and insuperable in the multiplicity. When you are conscious of your body-mind life, you are normally ignorant. But that's not a necessary and permanent condition. That's what Srila is saying. He is saying that it's very possible to be in the normal consciousness of with your body-mind life and yet have a divine consciousness while in the body. There's an idea that you can know the divine only when you lose consciousness of the physical world. In other words, only deep samadhi, sleeping samadhi. Then it is possible your consciousness to go there. So I'm just denying that. He's saying it's possible, even when you are conscious of the physical world, to have the consciousness of knowledge and not division, not ignorance. Brahman, as he exceeds the passivity and the activity, so too exceeds the unity and multiplicity. So, very clearly, the multiplicity is the physical world. The unity starts at the spiritual planes of consciousness, but Brahman can exceed both. Okay, he can exceed both at the third level. He is one in himself, but not with a self-limiting unity exclusive of the power of multiplicity. In other words, you mustn't think that when he is one, he is only one. And when he is multiple, he is only multiple. He can be, that's where the third level comes in. Okay. That's a Gita's contribution and Sri Aurobindo contribution also. He is one in himself, but not with a self-limiting unity exclusive of the power of multiplicity. We can have both. Third level, such as is the separated unity of the body and the mind. Okay. So, he is not the mathematical integer. Okay. A mathematical integer is a full number, one, which is incapable of containing the 100 and is therefore less than the 100. But it's not like that in the spiritual field. He contains the 100, is one in all the 100. The Brahman in the many, in the many in the Brahman, and the one becoming the many. That's the same truth is being said in different words. He contains the 100. The individual can identify himself with 100 people. There is no problem. By 100,000, even million, he is one in the 100. One in himself, he is one in the many, and the many are one in him. I am in others, and others can also be in me. In other words, Brahman in his unity of spirit is aware of his multiplicity of souls, and in the consciousness of his multiple souls, is aware of the unity of all souls. This is a cosmic consciousness, very simple. I find myself to be in everybody, and everybody also, I can find them to be within me. In each soul, he, the immanent spirit, the Lord in each heart, is aware of his oneness. The Jivatman is the individual soul. Okay? When illumined by him, not when he is not illumined, when the Jivatman is not illumined by him, he is in ignorance. The Jivatman, the individual soul, illumined by him, aware of his unity with the one, is also aware of his unity with the many. So, this is the third level. Our superficial consciousness, identified with body and with divided life and dividing mind, is ignorant. But that also can be illumined and made aware. Multiplicity then is not the necessary cause of the ignorance. So, we can stop here today. And next we'll read the ignorance. So, he is trying to find the origin of ignorance. And the origin of ignorance is where the division starts. So that's what we will slowly come to the conclusion. Division starts at the very high level, okay? But it depends on which level you are. At the overmind level, which is this level 2, the highest plane of level 2, there also you can be ignorant. Division starts there. Ignorance is the opposite of knowledge, and knowledge is that when you see the oneness, you see the oneness, but you see the many also, you see the oneness in the many in the spiritual planes of consciousness. But in the supermind, everything is one. So we will read this next time. Ignorance, as we have already stated. Page 600. Okay. We stop here today.
Thank you, Rangana. Thank you.
Thank you, Rangan.
Rangana.
Au revoir.
Thank you.